My name is Brittany Freeman, and I chose the book The Great Chicago Fire and the Myth of Mrs. O'Leary's Cow. The book was written by Richard F. Bales. He did extensive research using documents that were saved from the fire, handwritten transcripts, over 50 interviews, and other primary source information. Mr. Bales also created a scale drawing that reconstructed the O'Leary neighborhood. Around 9 p.m. on Sunday, October 8, 1871, a fire started in a barn in the alley behind 137 DeKalb Street in Chicago. 2 days later, the blaze died out after burning nearly 3 1/3 square miles of the city. The Great Chicago Fire killed 300 people, left some 100,000 homeless, and destroyed $200 million worth of property. The Chicago Fire of 1871, also called the Great Chicago Fire, burned from October 8th to October 10th, 1871. Legend has it that a cow kicked over a lantern in a barn and started the fire, but other theories hold that humans or even a meteor might have been responsible for the event that left an area of about 4 miles long and almost a mile wide of the Windy City, including its business district, in ruins. Following the blaze, reconstruction efforts began quickly and spurred great economic development and population growth. In October 1871, dry weather and an abundance of wooden buildings, streets, and sidewalks made Chicago vulnerable to fire. The Great Chicago Fire began on the night of October 8th in or around a barn located on the property of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. Legend holds that the blaze started when the family's cow knocked over a lantern. However, Catherine O'Leary denied this charge, and the true cause of the fire wasn't determined until recently. In all of American and even world history, there is no animal that is more infamous than a cow belonging to Patrick and Catherine O'Leary that was accused of starting what Fire Marshal Robert A. Williams called a hurricane of fire and cinders. Even as the fire cut a swath through the city, neighbors and newspaper reporters quickly placed the blame on the O'Learys and their cow. In the early hours of October 9th, newspapers first reported that the blaze started when the cow, as Catherine milked it, kicked over a kerosene lantern. After the fire was put out, the story evolved and more blame fell on the O'Learys. Some papers reported that Mrs. O'Leary had been on welfare and that when the city officials discovered that she'd been selling her cow's milk on the side, they cut her off. The fire, it was implied, was an act of revenge. Other newspapers maintained that the fire was an accident and that the lantern had simply been knocked over. The cow also appears to be blameless, and several reporters came forward decades after the fire to admit that the story of the cow kicking the lantern was a fabrication, or at least came from the unreliable sources. Reporter Michael Ahern was working for the Chicago Republican at the time of the fire, admitted in a 1921 column in the Chicago Tribune that he and 2 colleagues made the cow story up to add some color to their copy. After that, another reporter, John Kelly, wrote to the O'Leary's grandson saying that he was the one that wrote the first instance of the cow story. Meanwhile, the Chicago Daily Journal explained that on the night of the fire, one of the reporters had gone to the O'Leary's neighborhood and heard the cow story from some neighbors there, and the paper ran with it without thinking or looking into it further. Recollections of the fire published by one of the O'Leary's neighbors said that the story started with some neighborhood kids who hadn't been in the barn or near it but spent the night telling anyone and everyone who would listen about a cow kicking a lantern anyway. Despite the board's conclusions, or lack thereof, the damage to Catherine O'Leary and her cow were done. The story of the cow and the lantern circulated quickly and widely and took hold in the public imagination and the history books. Mrs. O'Leary lived out the rest of her life as a virtual recluse, reportedly only leaving her home to attend Mass. Every October, reporters came to her looking for a quote for their fire anniversary stories, and she shooed them away, invoking the name of her son James, who grew up to be a gambling boss known as Big Jim O'Leary. "I know bad people," she'd say as she shoved the men to the door. She died in 1895. Her obituary and death certificate listed the cause as acute pneumonia, but neighbors and friends said the real cause was a broken heart from the unfounded blame she received. A century after her death, Catherine and her cow were cleared of any wrongdoing, and another suspect was discovered. Richard Bales, an assistant regional counsel with the Chicago Title Insurance Company, became interested in the fire when he wrote a paper about it for a college course. His company maintains the only set of land records that survived the blaze of 1871, and he used them to dig further into the legend of the O'Leary's cow and the cause of the fire. In 1997, he published an article and later a book on his research. One thing he found was that the fire probably wasn't intentionally set. The O'Leary's barn was full of animals, some of them belonging to neighbors, and some used for Catherine's milk. There were 5 cows, a calf, and a horse. There was also a new wagon nearby in the alley, and none of the property or real estate was insured. Had Catherine been in the barn when the fire broke out, it is unlikely that she would have run back into her home and allowed her property to both literally and figuratively go up in smoke. Bales wrote, "Instead, she would have cried for help and attempted to extinguish what was then just a minor bonfire and save the building and its contents." That November, the Board of Police and Fire Commissioners started an inquiry into the cause of and response to the fire. In interviews with the board, Mrs. O'Leary testified both that she never milked the cows in the evening and she was asleep in bed when the fire started, having gone to bed early, complaining of a sore foot. Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, a neighbor who was the first person to raise the alarm about the fire, also testified and confirmed Catherine's alibi. After 2 months and 1,100 pages of handwritten testimony, the board members couldn't say much about the origin of fire except that it started in the barn. Whether it originated from a spark blown from a chimney on a windy night or was set fire by human agency, they said, "We are unable to determine." The most significant thing Bales found in his research was reason to suspect that the fire was started by Pegleg Sullivan, the man who first noticed it. When he testified before the investigative board, Sullivan said that he visited the O'Leary house around 8 p.m. and found Catherine in bed and Patrick ready to join her. He headed home, but then kept going past his house and stopped in front of the neighbor's house to smoke a pipe. He looked up and saw a fire coming from the O'Leary's barn and ran to it to try to extinguish the flames and free the animals before seeking help. After mapping out the various homes and properties, Bales doubts Sullivan's version of events. First, the buildings were arranged in such a way from where he stood to smoke his pipe, Sullivan would not have been able to see the barn because another home would have blocked his view. What's more, as one might guess from his nickname, Sullivan had a wooden leg and couldn't move very fast. Yet he claimed he ran from his smoking spot to the barn, a distance about half the length of a football field, and escaped the barn before the fire consumed it, then ran to alert the O'Learys and authorities. Given his condition, the distances involved, and the speed at which the fire spread, Bales argues Sullivan could not have done what he claimed to without being injured by the fire. There's also the matter of why Sullivan walked past his house to smoke his pipe in front of the neighbors. Bales thinks that was part of an alibi, claiming to smoke his pipe where he did put him outside and close enough to the barn that he could claim to have seen the fire out of the view of his neighbors, the McLaughlins, who were having a party that night and would have been able to see him if he was standing in front of his own house. Bales argues that Sullivan was in or around the barn that night. His mother kept one of her cows there and he may have gone to feed it, and by accident, with a careless flick of a match or a stray ember from his pipe or bumping a lantern, started the fire. When he realized he couldn't put out the fire on his own, he ran for help and came up with a cover story to escape the blaze. In 1997, convinced by Bales' argument and evidence, the Chicago City Council passed an ordinance exonerating Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. The disaster prompted an outbreak of looting and lawlessness. Companies of soldiers were summoned to Chicago, and martial law was declared on October 11th. ending 3 days of chaos. Martial law was lifted several weeks later. The month after the fire, Joseph Medill was elected mayor after promising to institute stricter building and fire codes, a pledge that may have helped him win the office. His victory might have also attributed to the fact that most people of the city's voting records were destroyed in the fire, so it was next to impossible to keep people from voting more than once. Despite the fire's devastation, much of Chicago's physical infrastructure, including its transportation systems, remained intact. Reconstruction efforts began quickly and spurred great economic development and population growth as architects laid the foundation for a modern city featuring the world's first skyscrapers. At the time of the fire, Chicago's population was approximately 324,000. Within 9 years, there were some over 500,000 Chicagoans. By 1890, the city was a major economic and transportation hub with an estimated population of more than 1 million people. In 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Columbian Exposition, a tourist attraction visited by 27.5 million people. Today, the Chicago Fire Department Training Academy is located on the site of the O'Leary's property where the Great Chicago Fire started. In 1997, the Chicago City Council passed a resolution exonerating Catherine O'Leary, an Irish immigrant who died in 1895, and her cow. Chicago has a larger fire department and abundant amount of resources to help now. They now take better preventative measures in their dry seasons, better methods for responding to fires, and of course, way better investigative commissions to find out the truth to events that happen. Richard F. Bales, the author of my book, is the Assistant Regional Counsel with the Chicago Title Insurance Company. Finally clear Mrs. O'Leary's name of any wrongdoing in 1997 due to his research. To this day, his company maintains the only set of land records that survived the Great Fire of 1871. This page contains all of the sources I used to find the research over my book. This page contains all of my sources for my pictures, including some of the pictures also state who took them beneath the pictures.